So here we go. We're going to jump into this teaching series. And as some of you already know, all three of our campuses are involved in this series. Pastor Alan is speaking on this morning at Bathurst, and Pastor Ian is speaking at this at Bayview. And periodically through this series as well, we're going to be swapping teachers. You'll have Alan up here a little bit, you'll have Keith, you will also have Ian in a few weeks as well, Pastor Ian from the Bayview campus too. So we're trying to share the wealth and mix it up a little bit and give you a few different voices. One of the interesting things though about that too is if you're really intrigued with a certain subject matter and would like to hear a message, the message from a few different angles, you could go online and listen to what Ian says about this, what Alan says about this, what Keith says about this, and compare notes. You can also see who you think is the best preacher. Our quest over the next 8 weeks is to wrestle with the problem of God. And as you know, this series is based, as Keith mentioned, on Mark Clark's book of the same name. And as he mentioned as well, if you are in a campus group, you're going to be studying this book together with other people. Our messages on Sunday morning are designed to supplement that. Kind of like in university, this is the lecture, but you have to get into a tutorial to discuss it further. And that's really where the real learning happens, I believe. So if you're not yet part of a campus group, please make sure that you are. There's a nice booklet with all sorts of questions and comments and discussion things in there as well, and you'll have a lot of fun with that. And interestingly, here today too, at Arpit's suggestion, we have the youth here with us today. They've stayed in the service. Should we give them a round of applause? Because young people are really wrestling with a lot of these questions, and the school system is in some ways antagonistic to faith. And so it's important for those students to be here as well, so we welcome you to this as well. Mark wrote this book specifically to address some of the issues that skeptics have with Jesus and the Christian faith. And Mark was sensitive to this book, or this issue here, because long before he was a pastor, he was a skeptic. He had all sorts of issues and problems with Christianity, Christian faith, the issue of God, really wrestled through all those kinds of things. And it's quite interesting in the book to read a little bit of his history. Yet, as the back of the book says on the cover, it says, as he, Mark Clark, searched for answers to persistent questions about origins, meaning, and morality, he found that Christianity offered rational answers that were surprisingly better than any other worldview, religious or secular, in the marketplace of ideas. You might draw that conclusion too. But we want to acknowledge that in a church service like this, there are probably many people who do believe in God and their faith is quite secure and they feel very comfortable in that. They've done the research and the reasoning and the thoughtfulness and all of those kinds of things and have drawn some good conclusions, and you feel quite comfortable. But chances are there's people in this crowd as well, if you're a normal crowd, that struggle with issues of faith. That still have a lot of questions, even though maybe you tried to settle a few things in the past in your mind, you still have a lot of questions, a lot of concerns. I want you to know you're in good company today if you are in that category, because I'm a little bit that way as well. I'm naturally skeptical, naturally a little cynical, and I like to look at things from different angles. But I think it's important to realize that the church is designed as a place where we can wrestle through some issues and get some answers to our questions, don't you think? The church should never be a place where you check your brains at the door and then come in here and just have a lovely, lovey-dovey kind of time. It is a rational faith. It's a thoughtful faith. And it's important that we ask questions, have discussions, to say, you know, I kind of think my head and my heart are a little disconnected. Sometimes I think this but feel this, or I feel this but think this, and I still have questions about this or that or this. We all have those kinds of experiences, don't we? But we want to be investigating the whole issue of worldview, our faith view. And we want to make sure that what we believe is intellectually sound, makes reasonable sense, but also that it works. It works in this world. You don't want some airy-fairy kind of faith or worldview that doesn't actually make sense in this world. We want something that's going to be very, very practical. As Mark says in his book, the longer you're a Christian, the more you come to realize that faith requires skepticism. We all have a little bit of that in us, and that's all part and parcel of the whole faith process. That is okay. And again, some of you might be saying, well, what is with that title? But the title of the book, The Problem of God, comes from A.W. Tozer, a great pastor, a great mind, a great theologian, who actually used to pastor at Bayview Glen Church when it was downtown Toronto. But this is what he said. He said, all of the problems of heaven and earth, though they were to confront us together and at once, would be nothing compared with the overwhelming problem of God, that he is, what he is like, and what we as moral beings must do about him. That's a real challenge, isn't it? How many of you are maybe a little bit like me? You're naturally born skeptical. You're natural born skeptics. Can you put your hands up high so we can see? We're all, okay, so we're all in good company here. The rest of you are lying, probably. We sometimes see skepticism as something negative, when in reality it is very healthy for clarifying our worldview. Emily Dickinson wrote, we both believe and disbelieve 100 times an hour, which keeps believing nimble. Kind of an interesting way of saying that. Doubt and faith always coexist. And regardless of your worldview, none of us can be 100% certain, right? Thus requiring faith, that step of faith. If you are an evolutionist, you need to realize this morning that evolution is just as much of a faith view as Islam or Judaism, because you cannot prove 100% that evolution is true. An evolutionist would look at the data, draw some conclusions, but still would have to make a major leap of faith. It is a faith view to believe in that, because we do not have all of the answers. I love asking evolutionists who talk about the Big Bang, where did all those gases come from in the first place that created the Bang? And they cannot answer that question. There's certain things that we just don't know. So every worldview, again, requires faith. Now, if you are an atheist, we might not have a lot of atheists here in the view, but in the room. But you know, I sometimes jokingly say I don't believe in atheists. I say that jokingly. I don't believe in atheists because you can't be 100% certain. It is a faith view. Even atheism is a faith view. You get the point here? That everything that we believe will involve an element of faith. Nevertheless, we want to think through these things and wrestle through these things and draw some appropriate conclusions. And if you're wondering if faith is wrong or skepticism is wrong, just keep in mind that some of the major Bible characters really wrestled with that. You can probably think of a few of Abraham, even Jacob, Job wrestled with a lot of issues through his suffering. Even the close followers of Jesus like Martha and Peter and, of course, doubting Thomas, that we label him that way, when I think he was just a very honest guy trying to wrestle through these issues of faith. So if you are feeling skeptical a little bit, or if you do have questions, you are in great company, even of some of the Bible characters there. Now, personally, as I get older, there are aspects of my worldview that become clearer to me. But there are other things that become less clear to me. And sometimes I trade off on those things. And again, I think that interplay is a normal part of life. I resonate with the theologian and philosopher Blaise Pascal when he said, "We see too much to deny and too little to be sure." But I'm also learning that the opposite of faith is not doubt. but rather the opposite of faith, in my opinion, is fear. Many people, especially in our culture, fear making any kind of faith statement or defining any kind of worldview. And this is especially true for us as lovely Canadian people that don't have too many convictions about anything. We highly value tolerance in our society, don't we? And we feel we have to make sure that everybody's right and everybody's wrong and nobody's completely right and nobody's completely wrong. It's kind of like, remember, when the kids are playing soccer, every game ends up like a tie. And the kids know, wait a minute, I scored 7 goals, I only scored 2. Something's not right here, but we say, it's a tie. You know, it's a Canadian thing. You know, we like everybody to win. But the reality is, there is such a thing as truth, and we need to be pursuing truth. And there are some rights and wrongs in this world. As G.K. Chesterton said, to believe in everything is the same as believing in nothing. All worldviews are not created equal. And that is why wrestling through our worldview is a courageous thing. Choosing to ignore the big questions of life is easier, but it's probably lazy, and I might go a step further and say it's actually cowardly. To say, I don't know, I don't want to think about those things. It takes courage to work through issues of worldview, work through issues of faith. So if you're hungry for that kind of thing, give yourself a pat on the back right now. Go ahead and say, way to go, you're courageous. You know, we're going to wrestle through some of these things. Thomas Graham, a dean of a theological school, said, faith is reason gone courageous. And as we go through this study together, I hope that you will have the courage to clarify your worldview. And it will take longer than 8 weeks, but hopefully we'll get us all moving in the right direction. Now, I was so pleased to see in this book, so pleased to see on page 32 in this book that Mark referenced Brian Walsh and Richard Middleton's book called The Transforming Vision. And as an aside, I had the privilege of taking a course with Brian Walsh when I was in seminary. I had never met him before. He taught at the Institute for Christian Studies, and I was at Tyndale at the time. And somebody told me before I went into the class, they said, oh, you got a class with Walsh? That guy is insanely smart. Like, he is so bright. So, you know, in my mind, I've got this stereotype of a chubby, bald guy with glasses, you know, who's really intellectual, you know, maybe a tweed jacket or something like that, you're smoking a pipe and, you know, thinking about these kinds of things. So in he walks in jeans, running shoes, and a Batman t-shirt, long hair flowing down, he just kind of walks in, you know. And I tell you, though, this guy really was bright. And so much so that, and now this might not surprise you because I'm not a huge intellectual, but so much so that there were times that I felt my brain was on fire. Like, I felt I had smoke coming out of my ears kind of thing, because I was thinking harder than I'd ever thought before. And I actually sometimes had to go out of the room and just to let my brain cool down a little bit because I was overheating in that way. Incredibly bright, but what I appreciated about him was his clarity around worldview and worldview studies. And everybody has a worldview. Everybody has a faith view. Richard Dawkins has faith, again. Darwin had faith. Stephen Hawking has faith. We do not have all the data to prove a theory is absolutely right or wrong, but everybody has a worldview that is based in faith. Is that understandable? I've said that about 10 times already, haven't I? We all have a worldview. You do, I do. It's just a matter of clarifying that or really coming to grips with that and seeing if it's reasonable. Walsh and Middleton argue that a person's worldview is in response to 4 questions. And the questions are interesting here. They say, who am I? Where am I? What's gone wrong? And what's the remedy? Your faith, Your worldview is based on your response to those 4 questions. That might be a little simplistic, but I find it very helpful here. Now, for those of you who are very right brain, artistic, and you don't like thinking in terms of the left brain and all the logical kinds of things, you might see your worldview as a story, a narrative that defines your life. What is the interweaving story that helps you make sense of the world? But I certainly like these questions of who am I, where am I, what's gone wrong, and what's the remedy. You see, the first 2 questions are quite foundational, aren't they? Who are you? Whenever I think of that, my mind goes to Princess Bride. Remember that old movie, you know, where Inigo Montoya says, who are you? You know? But who are you? Where are you? How do we get it? What is this world in which we're in? I mean, those are some pretty big and deep questions. The first 2 are foundational. The next are very practical there. Because a worldview needs to be able to make sense of our experience and function in real life, doesn't it? And as we go through these series, I hope that you can give great thought to these 4 questions, because how you answer those questions determines what your worldview is. Now, because of the confusion around these issues of faith and worldviews, Mark Clark points out that in chapter 1, how many of you have read the book, by the way? Okay, just the chairman of our board and his wife, so that's very good. Make sure you get it, please. Because of the confusion, he says that often science and faith fight with each other. They have conflict with each other. They ridicule each other and try to put the other camp down. And nowhere is this battle seen more clearly than in the battle relating around science and scientific evidence. And this is the theme of chapter 1 of his book, The Problem of Science. And science and faith are portrayed as enemies or in competition with each other. For example, whenever a TV program comes on about the origins of our world, you'll notice that God is never mentioned, right? It's just assumed that God does not exist at all. He's conveniently bypassed. And our culture assumes that this world evolved through billions and billions of years, and that we as humans have evolved over billions and billions of years. And again, it is a theory, isn't it? It is not proof. And Christian thought cannot prove that God created everything. Correct? And often the church has been rather arrogant and offensive towards scientists. And if you fall a little bit more in the camp of being scientific in your orientation, our apologies for that, because the church has done a poor job. We've seen science as the enemy, and it's not necessarily the enemy. They're trying to think things through as well. And what Clark tries to point out is that instead of complimenting each other, instead of criticizing each other, let's compliment each other in the quest for truth. An interesting story by Rabbi David Wolpe. He's got a book called Why Faith Matters, which is an interesting book from a Jewish perspective. But he tells this interesting story. Let me read this for you here. He says, 1,000 years from now, when scientists have solved all the questions that plague humanity, they're finally ready for the ultimate challenge. They elect a representative to address God. God, says the scientist in charge, you are no longer needed. You served a function in your day, but that day has gone. We can do everything that you can do, so goodbye, God. There's a moment of silence, and then a voice booms out of the sky saying, you can do everything? And the scientist says, yes, everything. God says, can you make a human being out of dirt? And the scientist said, absolutely. Okay, says God, let me see you make a human being. And the scientist reaches down and he digs his hand into the earth, and God says, oh, no, wait a minute. Get your own dirt. You know, and that's a little bit reflective of the back and forth kind of battle there is between faith and science. We both like to poke fun at each other. And honestly, people of faith have done a poor job in acknowledging the great insight that science has brought us, and how silly it is for some groups to deny the evidence, say, of global warming or something like that, or those kinds of things. In fact, there have been, again, some real atrocities committed by the church towards scientists, including putting people to death for having alternate views, and that is not right. And I believe, again, that one of the key points Mark is making in this book, and you're going to discuss in your small groups, is that science and faith are both helpful in defining reality and in constructing a robust worldview. But again, much of our culture, and certainly the schools that our kids are part of here, are probably, they fall on the side of demeaning faith, don't they? In fact, sometimes Christian faith is mocked and ridiculed. And I remember even as I was growing up in school and feeling a little bit awkward being a person of faith when my science teacher was making fun of Christians all the time. And sometimes that anti-God voice is so loud, and our whole culture is screaming, science rules, science rules, science rules. Faith is not important, faith is not important. And, you know, as a person of faith, sometimes you're thinking, maybe I'm wrong. You know, God, are you out there? You know, God, if you are out there, could you please say something to me? Because I'd like to know that you're out there. Intuitively, in my heart, I feel that you are there. I sense that you are there, but can you talk to me? Do any of you remember that song by Great Big World, Say Something, I'm Giving Up on You? I think I got the lyrics for the screen here. You know how it goes, and I probably shouldn't venture singing it for you, but you know the first line. Say something, I'm giving up on you. Very simple song, eh? Eerie. I'll be the one if you want me to. Got to go high here. Keith, we should have you singing this. Anywhere I would have followed you. Say something, I'm giving up on you. You know how the song goes. And it's certainly in a romantic context there, but when you think of it, there's many people who are saying that to God, aren't they? God, could you say something, please? Because science seems to rule in our culture. And I'm about to give up on you. Could you please say something? I don't want to give up on you, but please say something. Maybe that describes a bit of your experience today. Maybe you are here saying that kind of thing. Lord, please speak to me. Maybe you came in through the doors here saying, I sure hope I hear something from God today. Because I'm not sure I'm detecting him as well as I would really like to. I think it is so important for us to recognize that God is speaking. He has not remained silent. He is saying something. He is revealing himself. The key for us is to open our eyes and open our ears and look and listen to what he is saying about the origins of life. And I think a wonderful passage in the Bible that addresses that so well is Psalm chapter 19. Let me read some of this for you. You can follow along on the screen. It says here, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth. Their words to the end of the world. In the heavens God has pitched a tent for the sun. It's like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is deprived of its warmth. It goes on, and the psalmist says, the law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The decrees of the Lord are firm, and all of them are righteous. They're more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the honeycomb. And by them your servant is warned, and keeping them there is great reward. Some of you are familiar with that psalm, aren't you? Let's walk through this a little bit, because this is declaring God is saying something to us, loud and clear. And he's pointing us in two different directions here. First of all, the psalmist would be saying, look up. Look up. And look at verse 1 to 6 again, if we can go to the next slide there. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God. You know, I remember a while ago being up north and seeing the most spectacular display of the northern lights, Aurora Borealis. Just beautiful. I've seen sheets of white light before in the sky, but this night it was just spectacular. Greens and blues and pinks, all different hues, and they were just all weaving together. It was just gorgeous, a beautiful painting on the black canvas of space. And how do we understand that? You know, we could say scientifically, well, the northern lights are actually a result of collisions between gaseous particles in the Earth's atmosphere with charged particles released from the sun's atmospheres, and variations in color are due to the type of gas particles that are colliding. You could say that. You wouldn't be much of a romantic, but you could say that, and that would be true, wouldn't it? That would be scientifically true. But another way to understand the northern lights would be to say, you know, God designed all of those particles in the way he did, so that then when they merge together, they create color, and it dances all over the sky. And he's developed a rhythm for these kinds of things in the universe. But why did he do that? Why does he do this? Is that just something that's random? Or is God intent on giving us a spectacular light show that is revealing of who he is and what he's like? You know, the grandeur of that, but the creative aspects of that as well. And when we look up and around and see that our whole world and our whole universe is actually shouting that there is a creator who is incredibly complex, incredibly creative. It's a different way to look at it. The psalmist here uses an anthropomorphism, speaking of the skies being the work of his hands, as if God crafted all of those kinds of things. Again, a scientist might ridicule that. Well, what do you mean God made that with his hands? But when you look through the lens of faith, you see that, boy, that could be the way it is. Now, God didn't literally do that with his hands, but he crafted those things. He created those things. I like what the passage says here. It kind of says the universe speaks but does not speak. Did you notice that? Day after day they pour forth speech, but then verse 3, they have no speech. No literal speech, but they are communicating all of the time. And God is saying here, look up, look all around, look at this world that we see here. God is saying something. He's not using words, but he's speaking. And there's not a day that goes by where God is not communicating something about himself to us through the world in which we live. If you look carefully at a painting or a sculpture, it will tell you something about the artist, correct? If you listen to a song written by someone, you can tell a little bit about that person from that song, can't you? Some of you know my daughter Amber is a musician and a songwriter as well, and she would write all of these songs growing up. And we'd go to pubs and bars and stuff where she'd be singing and to support her and listen to all of those kind of things. But there's one rule. We could not ask what the songs were about. So often they were about boys. And sorry, Amber, if you're listening to this here today. But we could not ask what they were about. But my wife and I could sit there and listen to those songs, and we could learn a lot about our daughter by the songs that she wrote. Likewise, we can learn a lot about God by his artistic expressions. But we need to look up. He is saying something. Let's not give up on him. He is saying something to us. The art reveals the artist. He talks about a bridegroom and an athlete, some interesting metaphors that he uses there. John Piper says this is our next slide. I'm jumped a little bit ahead here, but he says, the glory of God is not a reality that can be transferred merely by words. There is an immediacy in his discovery. A spiritual perception happens. Look at this. A holy taste is born. Isn't that an interesting phrase? A God-given revelation hits home, and no flood of words, no amount of reasonings, no mere arguments could ever impart what the heart sees when it sees the glory of God. Have you ever had that experience in nature, looking up at the sky, looking at trees? It's all speaking about God. God is communicating to us. He reveals himself. But then the psalmist says here, don't just look up, but look in. And here's the last part of the section of this psalm. It's speaking about God's revelation to us in the Bible. God communicated words to be written down so all people of all ages could hear him, not just in nonverbal ways, but in some verbal ways as well. And if you look at the next slide there, the law of the Lord is perfect, and the statutes of the Lord are trustworthy. All sorts of things that are said here about the Word of God, the Bible. The law, statutes, precepts, commands, fear, meaning the reverence of God, when the word fear is used in Scripture there. Decrees, God's given us rules, regulations, guidelines, teaching, instruction, announcements, pronouncements. He gives us all of these kinds of things through his written revelation. What he's like and how he wants to function with you and I as people. And these words are described as, again, perfect, trustworthy, right, radiant, pure, firm. The truth he reveals to us in the Bible is refreshing. It does bring wisdom. It brings joy. It gives illumination. His truth in the Bible is durable. It is steady. It's actually worth investing your life in, I personally believe. And God says, look up and hear what I'm saying, but look in and hear what I'm saying as well. And someone who really wants answers to those worldview questions will do that. They will not just look through the lens of science, they will also look through the lens of faith and understand that God is saying something to us. Do any of you remember the old movie Patch Adams? Remember that? I heard a little hum there. Some of you go, oh yeah, it's such a good movie, isn't it? You might recall the scene where there's a crazy old guy who keeps coming up to Patch and putting his fingers up in front of his face and says, how many fingers do you see? And he would say, 4. He goes, oh no, you're an idiot. And he'd walk away. So one day, Patch walks into his room and he says, tell me about the fingers, like what's going on with that? And so he grabs his hand and holds it up like this. And he says, how many fingers do you see? And he again says, I see 4. And he goes, no. He said, look past the fingers. You're looking at the problem, not the main thing. Look past the problem. And again, Pat says, I just see 4. And then the fellow who's sitting right across from him says, look at me. Look at me. Look past the fingers to me. And as he does that, in fact, hold your hand up in front of you right now and look at me. Look through your fingers to me. How many fingers do you see? More than 4. You probably see 8. When you look past the problem, you can see things in a bit of a different light, can't you? And when I think of the whole challenge between science and faith, and Mark goes into that, and you're going to discover this as you discuss it in your groups. You know, I kind of see it as 2 lenses in my glasses. These are my new glasses. I wanted to look cool like some of you guys, so I got a new pair of glasses. But, you know, we need to look through, when we're trying to figure out a worldview that makes sense in this world, we do want to look through the lens of science, don't we? The one lens. There's some good things we can learn. Their language might be technical, but it's trying to explain what God has created. And there's some real value in that, looking through the lens of science. But we also want to look through the lens of faith, don't we? Both are really important. Oh, there you are. You're back now. I lost you for a minute there. I can't see too well with my glasses off. But what is important is not the lens, right? It's what's beyond the lens. And God is the one who is beyond the lens. I really hope that we can all really think through these kinds of things in a robust, courageous kind of way. Mark Clark ends this chapter by saying this. He says, the problem is not that the evidence isn't there. It's that we overlook the signpost because we would rather believe in something else. If that describes you, I hope you're willing to consider that God has not given up on trying to get your attention. When the sun comes up tomorrow morning, it isn't only because of the earth's rotation, but because God is love. And behind all the wonderful beauty of a scientific study of this world, he wants us to discover the God who made it. Let's pray. Father, I think of the fella in Scripture who said to Jesus, Lord, I believe, but please help my unbelief. And many of us fall into that camp. We're going back and forth all the time. But Lord, I pray that you would give us insight. I pray that we would be open to what you're saying, that we would be receptive, that we would be honest, authentic in our search for truth. I pray that we would not be lazy or cowardly, but that we would really seek out answers to some of these big questions of life. I thank you that you have revealed yourself. And I pray that each one of us in this room would pay very close attention. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Can we stand as we close this morning?